All right. Well, we're letting everybody come into this webinar. Give it a few seconds. Good morning, everyone. It's so good to have everyone in the room here virtually. Thank you for joining us for this incredibly important discussion that we're about to have. And I want to extend a special thank you to our speakers for joining us today. I know you are both extremely busy, and I really do appreciate you making time to share your insights with our members. This is really important information at an important moment in time for all of us. And I want to thank all of the partners who help make this programming available all year long. So first, I'd like to thank our 2021 pivotal partners, Amazon, thank you, Ascension Seton, Dell Technologies, PIMCO, and Wells Fargo. I'd also like to thank our 2021 foundation partners. Look at all these wonderful companies that are supporting our business community. And to our corporate partners, a great group of businesses working hard to make this the best community possible. And a special shout out and thank you to Enoch Kiever for being a corporate sponsor for the Pulse on Policy series that is presenting this virtual discussion today. The Pulse on Policy series features conversations with elected officials and political leaders that allow attendees to hear and ask questions about the key issues affecting the business community. And with us here today, we have Jim Henson. For those of you that don't know Jim, he teaches in the Department of Government and is the executive director and founder of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, which is a hub of research and public affairs endeavors focused on providing nonpartisan resources for understanding and informed engagement with Texas government and politics. Dr. Henson and researcher Dr. Josh Blank also partner in Strategic Research Associates. And over the past year, they've worked with us to field a survey that you're going to be hearing about today. And I'd also like to welcome Lila Valencia. Dr. Valencia is Austin's city demographer. She's relatively new in this role. She's been here just under a year. Prior to that, she worked for 12 years at the Texas Demographic Center. Dr. Valencia leads the Strategic Data Initiatives team at the Housing and Planning Department and produces population estimates and projections to support the planning and the decision-making of the city. So she is a wonderful resource with us. She has relatively new in this role. Jim, of course, has been working with us on understanding what's happening in the community, what's important, and we are using this information to focus our work in the year ahead. So Jim and Lila, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks for having us, Laura, and thanks for the great introduction. I'm very happy to be here with Lila today. I think I'm going to go first if I understand the program correctly. So what I'm going to do is, like, any good public opinion pollsters, take over the screen and share some slides with you all. So give me 1 second to get that going. But as Laura explained, this is I'm going to share some of the results of a survey that we did in September of last year. We have been mining this for a while, and it's been a pleasure and very interesting working with the folks at the chamber on this. I'm going to go through a lot of slides relatively quickly because I don't want to overstep my time bounds, and I want to leave plenty of room for discussion and for the work that Dr. Valencia is going to present to you. So some of the technicalities, clear the underbrush. We surveyed 611 registered voters living in Austin and eligible to vote in city council elections. We collected the data from September 3rd to 12th, 2021. And while that's not yesterday, it's not too long ago. As we go along, I'll probably flag some things, or or if they come up in questions that may or may not have shifted in this time. Technicalities, a little under a plus or minus 4 percentage points for the full sample. And this data was weighted following professional norms for the distribution of age, race, and gender, according to our recent analysis of the voter file in Austin. Okay, so away we go. So, some good news first. We asked voters in Austin how they would rate the overall quality of life in the city. And the results were very positive, 18% very good, 47% good, as you see here. A very low level of real discontent there. 6% poor, only 6% said poor, 2% said very poor. And so this is fairly encouraging in terms of thinking about people's view of the city. Looking at drilling down into these results just a little bit by income, a reflection of, I think, what we all know about the cost of living in the city. The level of the quality ratings a bit lower for those with incomes under 80,000 than those with incomes over 80,000, and a little more substantial difference between non-college graduates and college graduates if we look at educational attainment. We also drilled down and asked people not just what do you think of life in the city, but how about rating the overall quality of life in the neighborhood where you live? Now, not surprisingly, both intuitively and in terms of some other work we've done in this area, the ratings go up when you ask people about their neighborhoods. So the very good rating goes up to 44%. The good rating's still high, and the poor ratings go down. So there's a certain theme that runs through some of the results in the survey that we see here and again about a sense of localism, if you will. People are very attached to the local areas they live in, and they have a sense of allegiance and a real affection for the areas in which they live. Not surprising, I think, as we see Austin's neighborhood development continue to change, and as the population grows and the city grows, we see, I think, a sharpening of the character of many of the neighborhoods, even as many neighborhoods are changing, and that poses problems in some areas. We also asked people very early in the survey, before we poisoned the well, if you will, or sort of got people thinking in certain directions. We give people what we call an open-ended question. We don't give them any pre-programmed response choices. We just say, tell us what you like most about living in Austin? Very familiar, I think. The people, culture, community, some response along those lines is the most frequent response, followed by the physical environment in the city, particularly the natural environment, the sense of nature, outdoors, and a lot of people mention the parks. And then a bit further down, but still fairly common, the cultural life of the city, the available activities, events, are the top three responses in that area. We also asked people if they thought that Austin was a good place to work. We're obviously focused on perceptions of the economy and people's day-to-day experience as participants in that economy. A large majority strongly agree. So not only is there a majority there, but there's intense agreement with the idea that Austin is a good place to work. Another 34% somewhat agree. Again, a pretty low level of discontent measured in here. Only 9% disagree with the statement, and most of those only disagree somewhat. Then when we ask about the broader economy, in a way that's a little bit similar to the overall quality versus the more localized personal quality, ask about the broader economy, responses are still very, very positive. Not surprisingly, 70% say the economy as good or very good, but that's a little bit lower than people's assessments of their own working situation, but still broadly positive. People recognize the economic growth in the city and the prosperity that many people are recognizing here. We didn't want to simply ask people to cheerlead on the economy, so we narrowed in on a different dimension this and reminded people that the Austin economy has been growing significantly, and we asked whether the growth has impacted them positively or negatively. And here we begin to see a bit more evidence of mixed results. Still, a majority, 54%, say that the growth has affected them positively, but we see a higher incidence of negative and ambivalent attitudes. 29% provide a negative response, 17% either choose a middle ground or, in to a much smaller extent, say that they don't know. Looking a little more closely at these, there's not an enormous amount of variation by either age, education level, or home ownership. And I think that the fact that there's not a lot of a variance between homeowner or difference between homeowners and renters is interesting. Not surprisingly, renters somewhat higher, but really within the margin of error. So, not exactly tied, but not a difference that I would say is significant at this point. When we look at this by race, income, and partisanship, we see somewhat more significant reports of the economy having impacted people negatively and a little bit more variance among groups. Significantly, Black Austinites have the highest incidence of saying that the economy has impacted them negatively, almost but not quite half. A little more than a third of those who earn less than $80,000, and Republicans about 13% more or 13% higher incidence of saying that the growth in the economy has impacted them negatively. Though again, none of those move into majorities of these subgroups holding these views. Though we should note that Black Americans come close. So that's largely good news, and yet we also asked a very standard polling question, which we ask in virtually every poll we ask where we're looking at assessments of the public mood. And that is, do you think things in Austin are going in the right direction, or have they gotten off on the wrong track? And lo and behold, only 29% say right direction, 54% say wrong track, and there's a lot of intensity in the wrong track views. We give people a follow-up when they say right direction. Would you say, you feel strongly about that, you strongly or not? And it's an evenly balanced question in the way we phrase it. 45% say wrong tracks, choose strongly in their wrong track feelings. And a high degree of ambiguity, 17%, or ambivalence, but 17% say they don't know, they're not sure. So we want to look more closely at this. Again, by age, interestingly, by age, race, and home ownership, not a lot of variance in the wrong track number. Everything pretty much hovers around that, the overall figure of 54% when you look at different age and racial and ethnic groups. You see a bit more variance, not surprisingly, when you look at the college, non-college distinction at educational attainment, when you look at party, and when you look at ideology. And we see this in other right track, wrong track measures. These kinds of general assessments are influenced by partisan predispositions. We see it in our statewide polling. It's very evident in national polling. So this question does raise certain kind of partisan and ideological dispositions, particularly if the overall climate has been discussed in partisan frameworks. And I think there's no doubt that we have seen that in Austin in recent years. Now, to poke around in this and to provide, a balanced view to our open-ended question about what people like about living in Austin, or what they like most about living in Austin, we also ask people what they like least on an open-ended basis. I don't think anybody watching this will be surprised by the fact that traffic and transportation top that list by a pretty good clip at 29%. And Austin traffic has obviously become notorious, and recent data about wait times has been in the news in the last week or so. Second behind that, some aspect of cost of living, homelessness, and housing costs, both in the high single digits, as the third and fourth most frequent cluster of responses. But that traffic transportation response tends to blow things out when you ask them about people's experience of living in the city. Now, we also explored people's views of potential problems and policy issues in the cities from a more fixed perspective. That is, we gave people a list of issues that we developed in conjunction with the chamber and based on past polling and our look at the public discourse in the city to get a sense of what people think is a problem. So we asked people whether they agreed or disagreed that the following items on this list were problems for people in Austin. Traffic still tops the list, but and even with some prompting at an even higher level, 89%. Interestingly, given our topic today and given the emerging conversation in Austin, housing costs are essentially tied with traffic when you raise the issue within an issue set. People also agree that homelessness is a major problem as part of these issues, a set of issues that all range at about 87%, 79%, or about 80% or above. Then there's a middle tier of issues, topped by crime and public safety at 65%. Again, another issue that's very much in the public discussion and in the public sphere. Interestingly enough, given what we know about the economy, good jobs really not moving the needle, a reflection of where we are with the economy. Nonetheless, a non-trivial amount, almost 40% say that good jobs are a problem. So as much as we hear about high wages, I think we're obviously in a prosperous economy, but there are people that are still having issues with that, almost certainly related to cost of living. Now, we also then asked people not just, is this a problem for the city of Austin writ large, but is this a problem for you personally? So what we're trying to do is get a sense of what people are focusing on or what their dispositions are as a public issue citywide. But then we also want to say, well, how about you? How about experientially? Are you having an issue with this? Now, this looks similar to the previous item with a couple of exceptions. For one thing, all of these shares are much lower. So there's much more common for people to be aware of a problem that is present or being discussed citywide than it is for them to have experienced it personally in most cases. Traffic is one, is the major exception to that. The personal experience of traffic is pretty close to the overall sense of it as a problem for the city. But overall, it's just a lower incidence of people, thinking that things are problems for them personally. The only ones more than 50%, COVID, which we should note that when we were in the field, we were still in the downside, but still in the Delta wave, the wave of the Delta variant in the pandemic, and housing costs way more than half. And we'll look at these a little bit more in a second. A middle tier just below 40% is displacement, and this is a question that basically flags the displacement of people from their neighborhoods by people with higher incomes, followed by the environment and property and zoning and homelessness fairly closely. Crime and public safety, cost of utilities a little bit lower than the high end of that 40% range. And then the other problems that move the needle somewhat on the citywide problems, much lower in terms of personal experience. Now, we should flag here that in terms of being a problem for people personally, some of these low ratings are an artifact of demographics and what we should think of as the baseline. There are a lot of people in Austin, being a car-centered city, that do not use public transportation. In terms of public education and childcare, you would want to look a little more closely at populations that have children, school-age children in the household. And on both of these, this number goes up a bit when you look at the share at this in the universe of people that do have children. Okay, I want to look at just a few of these quickly and look at where there's a gap, but what the gap is between people that recognize these things as an issue for the city, people that recognize them and experience them as a personal problem. As I said before, the gap on traffic is relatively narrow, only a 14-point difference. If you look at the coronavirus pandemic, which also ranked high in both of those lists, a little more of a gap opens up here in terms of personal problem versus problem for the city. Um, I think not a lot of surprises there. We can discuss that in the Q&A why I think that. Cost of housing, a bit more of a gap, but still, interestingly enough, a personal problem for more than half of the people in the city, well more, 60%. And I think that does flag this as a problem that is not only seen as a policy problem, which I think it's been recognized as for a while in the city, but it's also something that's experienced personally by a large block of Austin voters. And to drill down in that a little bit more, most of this is fairly, I think, to be expected. Renters more likely to see this as much more likely to see this as a personal problem than homeowners. But we do want to notice that more than half of homeowners do see it as a personal problem. Um, a Hispanic Austinites much more likely to see the cost of housing as a problem than white or Anglos, also true of African Americans. Those who earn fewer than, less than 80K, 80,000 a year, much more likely to see this as a problem than those that make more. And interestingly, younger Austinites see this as a problem more than older Austinites, reflecting, I think, the degree to which we have a lot of of a very young population moving to the city and encountering housing costs that I think in many cases are probably higher than they expected. A bigger gap in terms of the displacement of current residents by people with higher incomes. Looking at more common among renters, among those without a college degree, among Black and Hispanic Austinites, and among, again, younger Austinites compared to older Austinites. And that gap there between younger and older Austinites who see displacement as a personal problem, a very large one, which is a very interesting result in the survey. A much wider gap when you look at homelessness. Again, the salience of homelessness as a public policy issue has been very high in the city in recent months. Certainly, actually, really, I guess, in recent years. But a much lower incidence of this as a personal problem. So the personal experience of homelessness, again, 44% is not a trivial share, but almost half of the share that see this as a problem for the city. Now, geography is a real determinant here, and really probably the biggest one that we found in the data. It's a personal problem for 62% of downtown residents, compared to 48% of those who say they live close to Central Austin but not downtown, and 42% who live far from Central Austin. So this is somewhat intuitive that as a personal problem, the acuteness or your experience with it is reduced as you get farther from the city center. Nonetheless, a large majority still see this as a citywide policy problem. Crime and public safety, a much lower level of perception of this as a problem for the city than the top tier of problems that are in the 70s and 80s. Still, 65% see crime and public safety as a problem, but 43%, again, a much lower amount, see it as a problem for them personally. Now, who do Austinites look to for solutions to these problems? Something else we were clearly interested in terms of thinking about stakeholders and the chamber itself moving forward. We asked, are local businesses important or unimportant in addressing the major issues facing the city? 75% saw local businesses as important. That was part of a battery of questions, and when we asked people to assess the importance of a range of actors on the city scene, local businesses were the most frequent response, followed, I think not surprisingly, at 70% by local government. And then you can see the results of a range of organizations. One of the interesting things here that merits further work by the chamber and us is, if you look at the other highlighted result, 46% said corporations with employees in Austin, which is almost 30 points lower than local businesses. Now, there's some gray area there, perhaps, in how people perceive some of the terminology here, but I think it's unambiguous that Austinites expect local businesses to have a role in working with local government to address the problems that are facing the city. Now, we also asked near the end of the survey, do you think Austin's best days are behind it, or is the best yet to come? Now, having belabored the point about the wrong track, about the right track, wrong direction result, it's fair for people to say, well, what is this? If people think we're on the wrong track, how is it that people think that the best is yet to come? Well, I think, what this really gets down to is that the right track, wrong track is asking people to assess the status of the city now and in the very near future. It's a very immediate evaluation. This question asks people to evaluate Austin's future relative to its past. And while I think, many people in this room are certainly familiar with the reputation that Austin has, particularly among people that live here, that no matter, when you got here, you just missed the best time to live in the city. That attitude is not really very widespread. I mean, again, a third or so is not a trivial amount. But if we look at, the breakdown of the responses to this question, there's not much difference among age, which surprises me every time I see it. Not much difference among college attainment. Not much difference between renters and homeowners. Where we do see, some gaps is by race. Black Austinites less optimistic than other racial and ethnic groups, but not by a lot, frankly. Democrats more optimistic than Republicans, and liberals more optimistic than conservatives. But again, those gaps are not significantly large. I mean, they're not zero. But the gap between, an 11-point gap between liberals and conservatives is much smaller than the gap we see between liberals and conservatives, for example, in a lot of other areas. So what do we take away here? Austin voters have serious reservations about problems in the present, but they're largely optimistic about the future. And they have clear views of the stakeholders that they expect to bridge these gaps. So I think with that, I'm going to hope that I've not taken too much time and hand it over to Lila.
Thank you, Jim. Let me go ahead and try to bring up my slides. Okay, can everybody see that? I'm going to assume that you can see that. Let me see. I'm a little frozen here. Oh, there we go. Am I sharing now? Yay. Okay. So let me go ahead and share. First of all, thank you, Laura, for that introduction, and Jim. I'm so excited to be able to present about Austin's favorite. What they like most about Austin is its people. So let me go ahead and get started and share with you some findings from the 2020 census. So basically, the 2020 census data were released about last year, about September. And what we found was that Austin continues to grow. And let me see if I can move my screens forward. Boy, I'm really struggling with this one today. My apologies. I'm trying to move to the next slide here and can't seem to do that. There we go. So let me tell you a little bit about Austin's population growth, Austin's unique diversity that we're seeing as our population grows. And then I'll share a couple of maps with you showing where some of the population change is taking place. And then quickly just recap or go through some socioeconomic trends that have been taking place throughout the decade as well. Those data don't come from the 2020 census, but they're the most recently available data that we have. So what the 2020 census data show is that our population continues to grow. We have had a trend of doubling our population every 20 to 25 years. And so if you take a look around 1970, we were at about 250,000 people. Then between 1990 and 2000, we surpassed the 500,000 mark. And then by 2020, we're at just shy of 1 million at about 961,855 people. Now, I realize this is a little lower than some folks were expecting. And I think there's a number of things that we are, still looking into to make sure that our count was the best count that it could have been during that very, very challenged census. But also just taking note of different demographic characteristics that perhaps are, helping to slow down our rate of growth in the city. But we continue to grow. And in fact, we added more people than only 3 other cities added more people than the city of Austin between 2010 and 2020. We added about 171,000 people, and only the cities of New York and Houston, and these are big cities, added more people than Austin and also Fort Worth. We are growing at a rate of about 21.7%, and we continue to be the 11th largest city in the country. When we take a regional look and look at the 5-county metro region, of course, including Bastrop, Caldwell, Hayes, Travis, and Williamson, we are seeing even faster growth. So while Austin was growing at a rate of 21.7%, you can see here that the Austin metro region is growing at a rate of 33%. And we actually were the fastest growing metro region in every single year this last decade. And while Austin and the metro region are growing very rapidly, some of the individual cities within the metro and surrounding the city of Austin are growing even faster. A number of these Central Texas cities have topped the Census Bureau's lists of fastest growing cities in the country year after year, including Manor and Leander and Cedar Park most recently. But also growing really, really rapidly are cities like Manor and Buda and Hutto. And I recognize that the city of Austin's share of growth in terms of the metro region is smaller today than it has been in the past, and that some of the surrounding areas are growing much faster than the city of Austin. But one of the things that I'd like to point out is that the bulk of the growth is still taking place here within the city limits. So even if you look at its largest neighbor to the north, the city of Round Rock, the growth in that city was 1/10 of the growth that took place in the city of Austin this last decade. And also, if you look at Leander, that growth, and it was large growth, was only 2/10 of the growth that we see in the city of Austin. So that means that Austin is still a large contributor to the growth in the region as a whole. And so how is this growth happening? Where is this growth coming from? Us demographers like to look at our components of population change in order to try to break down where growth is coming from. And so between 2019 and 2020, these are the most recently available data for the Austin metro area. About 3/4 of our total growth that we added that year came from domestic migration. Now, domestic migration means people who moved from other states into the Austin metro area, but it also includes people who moved from other places in the state of Texas, which in fact is the largest share of movers to the Austin metro area. We get a lot of people who are moving from the Dallas area, the Houston area, the Rio Grande Valley into the Austin metro area. But we do have a significant share that is also moving from other states. And the reason of this increased share, so throughout the decade, the percent of growth that's come from domestic migration has been about 50% or so, a little bit higher than 50%. But recently, 2019, it increased to about 2/3 of the growth. And then this last 2020 year, it increased to about 3/4 of the growth. And some of the increase in that share is definitely related to increases in numbers of newcomers, but it's also paired with decreases in numbers of international migrants that we started to see as a national trend since about 2016, 2017, really starting to decline and driven by fewer and fewer Mexican migrants coming into the country, but also decreases in natural increase. And this is the difference between births minus deaths. We are seeing higher numbers of deaths, lower numbers of births. And when we're looking at the most recent data that are available for Texas and for 2021, what we're seeing is that there continues to be a higher share of domestic migration coming to the state and real steep declines in international migration that are now being driven more by COVID-19. And then, of course, that continues to be paired with impacts from COVID in increases in deaths and then moderate declines in births. We won't have these data for the Austin metro region until later this year, but we do continue to see, or we expect to continue to see domestic migration play a significant role in our growth. So now let's talk a little bit about our city's unique diversity. And I'm going to focus on the city of Austin in this sharing of data. Basically, I want to start off by saying that all of the city's population, race, ethnicity groups grew this decade. So 2000 to 2010, we had seen a decline in the Black population. That is no longer the case. All of our race ethnicity groups grew this decade. And then I'm going to share with you, I've tried to depict in this little pie graphical representation of our racial ethnic makeup of our city, just how we can have a decrease in share of a population while that population continues to grow. So there you can see a smaller pie for 2010 and then a slightly larger pie for 2020. So although no race ethnicity group made up the majority in the city of Austin, the non-Hispanic white population continues to make up the largest share of the population at 47%. And this is a slight drop from their share in 2010 at nearly 49%. The Hispanic population also saw a decrease in its share from 2010. Hispanics dropped about 3 percentage points and now make up 32.5% of the city's population. The Asian population is now the third largest race ethnicity group, and they make up about 9% or close to 9%, and that's up from about 6% in 2010. The Black population now makes up 7% of the total population, and this is a 1 percentage point decline from the start of the decade or from 2010. So hopefully you can see how our population is growing and all of our race ethnicities are growing, but their relative share of a larger pie is what is decreasing. And then I want to just mention a couple of other notes about our changes in the racial ethnic composition of our city between 2010 and 2020, because what's taking place in Austin is truly unique. So throughout the country and throughout the state of Texas, populations of color largely drove growth. In Texas, 95% of the total population growth in the last decade can be attributed to populations of color. So about 5% of that growth came from non-Hispanic white population. In the city of Austin, we see something different. Over or close to 40% of the population growth that took place in the city can be attributed to the non-Hispanic white population. And this, of course, is very unique. There are really only about 3 other cities that had the same pattern of growth, and those are the city of Phoenix, the city of Denver, and the city of Raleigh. So similar cities in terms of industry and other similarities with the city of Austin, but really a minority when we are taking a look at this trend that's taking place across the country. And this is also at a time when the country experienced a decline for the first time in 230 years in the number of people identifying as non-Hispanic white. So seeing such a strong growth among this community in our city is truly unique. Now, when we look at the fastest growing groups, race ethnicity groups in our city, it's those individuals that looked at the census form and they said, there is not a race group that represents me here. And they filled in another race group in an open field. And so they are of another race. And then also really growing very rapidly is the multiracial population. So these are individuals that identify with two or more races. Both of these race ethnicity groups more than doubled in the last decade. Some of that change can be attributed to some coding changes in the census, but this was also a trend that we had seen prior to this census. And then the Asian population is the fastest growing single race group. Over 1 in 5 of the people that were added this last decade are of Asian descent, and they made up over 20% of the growth in the last decade. Hispanics also made up about 20% of the growth this last decade in the city. But of course, this pales in comparison to their rate of growth in the state of Texas and in the country, where they were contributing about half of the total growth in many of these areas. And then the African American population also continues to grow, but at a much slower rate. This is in the context of very strong migration by African Americans to cities in the South, including Dallas and Houston. And when we look at the total growth of the African American population in the state of Texas, Austin only received less than 1% of that total growth. We added about 5,242 African Americans this last decade. And to put that into perspective a little bit more, similarly sized Fort Worth added nearly 40,000 African Americans this last decade. The data that were released look at the total population and then the population 18 and older. And so we're able to calculate the child population from those numbers, even though we don't have additional information on individual age groups. But what we see is that our child population continues to grow. It grew by over 11,000 in this last decade. And it is about a similar share to what we can see in across the country. But what we are seeing is that growth in the child population was largely driven by the Asian population, as well as the non-Hispanic white population and multiracial children. And we actually saw a drop in the number of Latino and African American children in the city of Austin between 2010 and 2020. And when we look at all of the children added between 2010 and 2020, of every 10 children, 6 of those children were of Asian descent. And, we look at the child population as demographers to try to get a sense of what the demographic makeup of an area may look like in the future. And when we look at this set of data, what we're seeing is that there are fewer African American and Hispanic children in Austin, and perhaps in the future, there could be fewer Latino and Black adults as well. So now I'm going to show you a couple of maps, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I do have a link that I can share with you where we have an interactive set of maps, and you can really drill down and see, changes in different race and ethnicity groups and total population. And sometimes, seeing these maps on a screen can make it a little bit difficult to see the detail. But generally, what we're showing here is the percent change in the population as a whole between 2010 and 2020. There have been increases in all of those areas that were shaded in that are shaded in white and shades of blue, and then declines in those areas that are in pink and in red. And what we can see, especially if you really look at the metro area map, is quite a dispersal of population and some suburban sprawl. However, when you look at the map of just the city of Austin, we start to see that where we have encouraged dense population in places like, let me pull up my little laser pen so I can zoom into it, but in places like the Domain, the Mueller development, areas of downtown, we really have seen strong population growth as well. And we have seen similar growth in some of these areas that we saw in some of these outlying areas as well. And this is for the total population. The next set of maps focuses on individual race ethnicity groups. This is the percent of the population that is Asian by census tract. And what we can see in this regional map is sort of a continued suburban sprawl, particularly into Williamson County, into parts of Cedar Park and Leander and Liberty Hill. And then we see some declines in the eastern parts of Williamson County. And when we zoom into the Austin area, we can see some of those places around south of Riverside and Lamplight Village also experiencing some declines, but significant growth in some of those more densely populated areas of Holly neighborhood, as well as Lakeline and the Anderson Mill area. This is the map for the non-Hispanic white population. We are seeing less of a suburban sprawl, but there are still some pockets of very high growth towards Liberty Hill and Leander. And then when you zoom into the Austin area, you can see some real increases in the share or in the population growth in the non-Hispanic white population, particularly in parts of East Austin and those more densely populated areas of the Domain, the Mueller neighborhood, and parts of the downtown area, especially south of the river. Now, this map is for the African American population, and we see also some of that suburban sprawl, right, where we are seeing more growth towards Pflugerville, growth towards Bee Caves, and also towards Leander and Liberty Hill. And then when we look at the Austin area, we can see a real sharp declines in the traditional neighborhoods of African Americans in Central East Austin, as well as those neighborhoods that were east of 183 and MLK. And then this is the last map that I have to share with you, and this is the percent change in the Hispanic population. Again, we see some suburbanization taking place in around Liberty Hill and Leander area. And then we also see some growth in the Pflugerville area. When we zoom into the Austin area, we see real declines in the Hispanic population in those parts of East Austin, Southeast Austin, as well as those parts along North Lamar. And so what we're seeing is sort of a farther eastward movement for both the African American population and the Hispanic population of that eastern crescent. So now I'm going to just show you a couple of slides with some information on socioeconomic trends. And I could share a number of slides with you that look just like this, where the Austin metro area compared to other metros in the state and compared to the state as a whole, really Austin leads the pack in many of these indicators, whether it's educational attainment or household incomes, whether it's health insurance rates, low poverty. The Austin metro area is doing really well. However, what these charts also demonstrate is that even though we are leading the pack amongst these indicators, when we disaggregate these data by race and ethnicity, we are not breaking the trend that we are seeing in other metro areas, where there are huge disparities remaining between these outcomes for African Americans and Latinos compared to non-Hispanic whites and for Asians. And so you can see that here in this educational attainment chart. One metric where we don't necessarily lead the pack, however, is in home ownership rate. And this is something that Jim touched on, where there was a finding where there was not much difference between home ownership and renters, or homeowners and renters. And it may be because in Austin, there are almost as many renters as there are homeowners, if not more. And what we are seeing, though, is that home ownership rates are much lower for Hispanics and African Americans in the Austin Metro, as well as lower in Austin Metro relative to other metros in the state of Texas. So we have a long way to go, especially when we look at a metric like this. And so while we're adding about 47 people a day to our Austin population and nearly 3 times as many to our metro area, we're bound to feel some growing pains, right? And we are seeing these growing pains in some of the topics also covered in Jim's presentation in terms of median home prices. They've increased by over 54% in the last 10 years in the city of Austin, with a median home price of about $550,000. Our median incomes have only grown about 50% during this time period, and our median rents are also increasing due to spillover effects of people who can't afford to buy a home are much more likely to then be renting. The average rent right now, as of February 2022, was about $2,000 for a 2-bedroom apartment, and this has also increased over the last 10 years. And then we are seeing longer commutes for all of us, but we are especially seeing increases in commutes for those individuals that are traveling over an hour. And if you keep in mind those maps that I showed you just a minute ago, the folks that are going to be disproportionately impacted by these longer commutes and poor quality of life are definitely going to be those that are moving farther and farther out of the city, and typically communities of color. And so one of the things that this sort of may bring to us, right, is a bit of a sense of cognitive dissonance, right, where it's like, how are we experiencing strong growth, but then also talking about displacement? And absolutely, our city is growing and it's rivaling the growth of major cities in the country. But we are seeing declines in the population, especially amongst children of color. How are we talking about increased diversity when we're also talking about loss in shares among the African American population and the Latino population? And what I'd like to note there is that absolutely our city is diversifying, but we are definitely not following the trends that we are seeing at the state level or at the national level. And we are seeing so much development with, so many construction cranes taking up over our skyline. How are we also talking about low inventory and lack of supply in our housing market? And so one of the things that that I didn't share with you here is that, yes, we added more housing units than we have in decades past, but that rate of growth is slowing down. And our population rate of growth is also slowing down, but we have a long and sustained trend of population growth. So maintaining that housing inventory and continuing to build on that is going to be critically important. And of course, all of these issues that I'm talking about will definitely have great implications on issues of transit and transportation planning, access to schools and healthcare as people move farther out of the city, and of course pressures on utility infrastructure, and then workforce dynamics, especially with talks of the Great Resignation, the Great Resign, and that paired with the aging of our population. Yes, we are young, but we are still an aging population here in the city of Austin. So all of these demographic shifts, will definitely have great implications for some of these future policy planning areas that we will need to address. How these feelings of dissonance and different experiences by different communities in the city are brought together in terms of policy will be the challenge that we need to face next. And that's my my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can hopefully have some time for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Valencia and Dr. Henson. That was just incredibly rich information. And we're going to try and end on time, but I do want to ask you both one question. So one of the core functions of the Austin Chamber is to bring business leaders together to solve local problems. And we've got a bunch of business leaders that have been watching your presentations. We also saw from the survey results that the public is looking to local business leaders to help solve community problems, which is an encouraging finding for us. Could you give us a sense, based on the data that you collect and that you've been looking at, how can we be helpful in bringing this community together, and what would you have us focus on? What does all this data lead you to in terms of the highest impact work that we could be doing as a business community on behalf of the region?
Lila, why don't you go first? You're warmed up.
Sure. Yeah. A little too warmed up. Yeah. So, thank you for that question, Laura. And seeing the findings from Jim's survey really indicate that, yes, folks are going to be looking to local business leaders for some of these solutions. And I think that some of the things that we can, that business partners can help with is definitely having a sense of awareness, right, of the unique trend that's taking place in our city, the unique diversity that's taking place. How do we make those businesses aware of the need for diversity in some of the industries that they are leaders in, right? So we know that information technology, financial technology, they're not always the most diverse in terms of their racial, ethnic makeup of their workforces. So what can they do to make improvements on that end so that when they do come to our city, they aren't exacerbating that sort of racial makeup that we are losing in terms of some communities of color. I think for the communities that are already here, what kinds of upskills training can we get to our entrepreneurs and to people who are looking to get into new industries? We know we have a strong economy, but we also know that we've lost some jobs that we are not going to recover from the pandemic. So what can we do to ensure that people are able to enter this new emerging labor market and economy? And then what additional capacity building efforts can we do for our local businesses of color that are already in place and really kind of maintaining those cultural bedrocks in our community as some communities of color are displaced?
Excellent. Jim, how about you?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with any of the things Lila said. I think what I would add is probably, it's probably because I'm trained as a political scientist rather than a demographer. I think about process more, and I think that one of the things that, looking at the template of all the data that is so fascinating that Lila's shown us, and looking at the polling data in conjunction, suggests that, what we see people, what I would say people want based on the survey, is confronting those problems in ways in which the business community and local government act as stakeholders rather than protagonists in a big debate, and to create venues that are inclusive and transparent, but that also try to sidestep some of the more polarized debates that are coming to the city, to my mind, from the outside rather than bubbling up inside the city. Now, there are limits to that metaphor, but I think when you look at quality of life issues that are important to people, like housing, like affordability, my sense is that the city, residents of the city, and particularly voters, they're not voting for people, and they're not looking for stakeholders to start a fight. They're looking for people to solve the kind of infrastructure and capacity and diversity problems that are widely recognized by people. And so I think, the best, I think, strategy is to avoid getting into the very polarizing fights and trying to lower the temperature when policy fights become polarizing, and to continue to stay at the table with a real problem-solving focus, if that's at all possible.
That's great advice from both of you, being a trusted voice in community conversation and being constructive in our participation. Of course, that's the goal that we have. That's how we are bringing forward the issues and tackling the issues that are important to this community. Lila, Jim, thank you. There's so much here that is valuable to this whole community, and we appreciate your time. We appreciate the work that you do. And thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. There have been lots of requests for the data, so we'll figure out a way to get that back out to people. I know, Lila, yours is probably mostly on web pages, but we will follow up in getting this information out. Let me give you guys a couple of upcoming events. On February 23rd, we have our Tech Talk. On March 9th, Cheers to the Year, where we will be honoring our Austinite of the Year, who is Dr. Colette Pierce Burnett. And please reach out to us if you want to have a conversation about what you've heard here today. We are happy to get in conversation with you. Thanks, everyone.